On a bustling Monday morning, Sarah Chen strode into the marble halls of the downtown courthouse, wearing ripped jeans and an oversized Yale sweater that concealed her designer suit underneath. Her strategy was calculated. Her appearance, a carefully crafted facade that had helped her expose discrimination in 12 other state courts across the country, today would be number 13, and she could already feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders as security guards exchanged judgmental glances. The early autumn sunlight streamed through the towering courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as Sarah purposefully scuffed her worn sneakers against the marble. Her carefully orchestrated appearance had taken hours to perfect, from the messy bun secured with a pencil to the smartphone with its cracked screen protector that concealed a state-of-the-art recording device. She was a masterpiece of misdirection, every detail designed to invite underestimation and prejudice. The security line stretched nearly to the door, but Sarah didn't mind. The wait gave her time to observe, to catalog the subtle ways the guards treated different people differently. She watched as they ushered a man in an expensive suit through the fast-track line while making an elderly Asian woman empty her entire purse. Sarah pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll through social media while actually documenting every interaction, her hidden camera catching each raised eyebrow, each condescending smile, each small abuse of power. Two young officers at the security checkpoint were particularly interesting to watch: Officer Brooks and Officer Martinez. According to their name tags, they played their roles like actors in a well-worn show. Brooks was the intimidator, his stance aggressive, his voice carrying unnecessarily across the hall, while Martinez played good cop, offering apologetic smiles that did nothing to soften the impact of their actions. Sarah had seen this dynamic dozens of times in other courthouses, but these two had perfected their routine. As the line inched forward, Sarah began her own performance. She deliberately fumbled with her bag, letting a few papers slip to the floor. When she bent to retrieve them, she made sure to grab them with shaking hands, a show of nervousness that prompted knowing looks between the officers ahead. She could hear Brooks berating a teenage boy for wearing a hood indoors, his voice echoing off the high ceilings, while nearby visitors pretended not to notice. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. She had done this 12 times before. But each courthouse was different, each operation unique in its own way. Her team was already in place, scattered throughout the building, looking like ordinary citizens, but ready to document everything. Judge Harrison would arrive in exactly 47 minutes, right on schedule, but until then she had a role to play, a character to inhabit, a system to expose. When she finally reached the front of the line, Sarah let her hands tremble slightly as she placed her bag on the conveyor belt. She could feel Brooks sizing her up, categorizing her, his prejudices clearly visible in his dismissive glance at her worn clothing and ethnic features. Martinez barely looked at her ID before waving her through. Their casualness, their assumption of her insignificance, was exactly what she had hoped for, exactly what she needed. As she gathered her belongings, Sarah dropped her phone, watching with hidden satisfaction as Brooks barked at her to hurry up while Martinez sighed dramatically. She apologized profusely in heavily accented English, another calculated move that prompted Brooks to exchange an eye roll with his partner. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. As she moved deeper into the courthouse, Sarah could feel the weight of her real credentials against her chest, hidden beneath the oversized sweater. In precisely 45 minutes, she would reveal her true identity. But until then, she was just another face in the crowd, another victim of systemic prejudice gathering evidence with every step she took. The club station was a scene of barely contained chaos that morning, with a line of increasingly frustrated citizens snaking through the lobby. Officer Rogers' massive frame dominated the space behind the counter, his uniform stretching tight across his shoulders as he shuffled papers with the aggressive energy of someone looking for a fight. Beside him, Officer Miller lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone between making snide comments about the citizens they were supposed to be helping. Sarah positioned herself strategically in line beside a young mother struggling with a fussy baby. The woman's desperate attempts to quiet her child were met with loud sighs and pointed glares from both officers. Sarah watched as Rogers deliberately shuffled papers, slower making the mother wait longer, while Miller muttered something about people needing to find babysitters. The hidden camera in Sarah's cracked phone captured every moment, every microaggression, every abuse of power that most people had learned to accept as normal. The tension in the air thickened as an elderly man at the front of the line struggled to understand the complex form requirements. Roger's voice boomed across the lobby like a cannon, making the man flinch as he explained for the third time that the signature needed to be in blue ink, not black. Sarah noticed how Miller smirked at his partner's bullying behavior while continuing to tap away at his phone, occasionally looking up only to make faces at the other officers stationed nearby. When the elderly man finally stepped away, his hands shaking as he clutched his rejected paperwork, Sarah calculated her approach. She had perfected this routine in 12 other courthouses, but something about these two officers told her they might be her most challenging subjects. Yet Rogers was already red-faced from yelling, his tie loosened at his thick neck, while Miller had finally put his phone down, sensing more entertaining possibilities as Sarah stepped forward. Sarah deliberately fumbled with her papers, letting a few flutter to the ground. As she approached the counter, she could feel the eyes of other citizens on her, some sympathetic, others just grateful not to be the target of the officer's attention. She spoke softly, forcing Rogers to lean forward to hear her, asking about Form A38 in carefully broken English, watching as his face darkened with each word she spoke. Miller finally abandoned his phone completely, now fully engaged in what he clearly expected to be quality entertainment. He stood up, walking to stand beside his partner. Their unified front, designed to intimidate Sarah, kept her shoulders hunched, making herself appear smaller, more vulnerable, while her hidden camera continued recording their increasingly aggressive behavior. Above them, the security cameras were quietly capturing everything from another angle. Cameras Sarah knew were feeding directly to her team's secure servers. Even as the officers assumed they were safely within their domain of power, she could see other courthouse employees gathering at nearby stations, drawn to what they expected to be another routine humiliation of a confused citizen. Sarah took her performance to the next level, deliberately misunderstanding Roger's increasingly loud instructions. She watched as veins began to stand out on his neck, his patience visibly evaporating with each passing second. Miller had given up any pretense of professionalism, now openly laughing as his partner became more agitated. Sarah kept her expression carefully, confused, while noting every violation of courthouse conduct codes, every breach of professional standards, every moment that would soon become evidence. The young mother with the baby had moved closer, perhaps sensing that something significant was unfolding. Other citizens in line had begun to pull out their phones, their own cameras capturing what they perceived as yet another example of power being abused. Sarah knew her team, scattered throughout the courthouse, were also recording from different angles, creating a comprehensive record that would leave no room for denial or excuses. Rogers finally snapped, grabbing Sarah's carefully disorganized papers from her hands, his aggressive movement causing several people in line to gasp. Miller stepped closer, his body language threatening as he told her she clearly needed to learn how things worked in America. Sarah allowed her hands to shake as she reached for her dropped papers, while silently counting down the minutes until Judge Harrison's scheduled appearance, knowing that every second of this interaction was building towards something these officers could never anticipate. The atmosphere in the courthouse lobby had transformed into an electric arena as Sarah deliberately scattered her papers across the floor, creating a chaos that drew every eye in the vicinity. She moved with calculated clumsiness, dropping to her knees to gather the documents, while Officer Miller towered over her, his shadow falling across her small frame like a looming storm cloud. Nearby, Officer Rogers stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched his partner prepare to make an example of yet another immigrant who dared to waste their time. Sarah could hear the whispers rippling through the growing crowd, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, but most simply relieved they weren't the target of the officer's apparent frustration. She kept her head down, allowing her long dark hair to partially obscure her face, while her hidden camera captured every moment from the perfect angle, catching Miller's exaggerated eye roll as he began reciting courthouse regulations in an unnecessarily loud voice designed to humiliate and intimidate. More officers had begun to gather around the scene, like moths drawn to a flame. Officer Chen, no relation to Sarah, stood at the edge of the group, his discomfort visible in his rigid posture, but his silence speaking volumes about the culture of compliance that Sarah was here to expose. Officer Rodriguez leaned against a nearby pillar, openly chuckling at what she assumed would be another routine display of authority over a helpless civilian. If only they knew that every laugh, every smirk, every moment of unprofessional behavior was being live streamed directly to the White House Ethics Committee. Sarah fumbled with her papers a few moments longer, deliberately mixing them up. As she tried to organize them, this prompted Miller to step even closer, his boot deliberately nudging one of her forms further away as he spoke slower and louder, as if volume could bridge what he assumed was a language barrier. Rogers had finally moved from his post, joining his partner in what they clearly viewed as a moment of shared entertainment, their matching expressions of superiority caught perfectly by the security cameras above. The tension escalated as Sarah began to respond to their commands in broken English, intentionally misunderstanding their simplest instructions. She could see the veins in Miller's neck beginning to pulse as his frustration mounted, while Rogers' face had turned an alarming shade of red that nearly matched his hair. Other courthouse employees had stopped pretending to work now, openly watching the drama unfold, some even pulling out their phones to record what they assumed would be another viral video of immigrant harassment. Sarah reached for her phone as if to translate something, and that's when Miller made his crucial mistake. He snatched the device from her hand, declaring it was disrespectful to ignore their instructions by playing with her phone. The irony of his earlier behavior completely lost on him. Sarah let out a small gasp of protest, her voice carrying just enough to draw more attention, but not enough to seem confrontational. She had orchestrated similar scenes before, but these officers were proving to be exceptional subjects in their dedication to unprofessional behavior. The crowd had grown larger, now forming a loose circle around the scene. Citizens, with their own business to conduct, found themselves drawn into the spectacle. Sarah noticed several of her planted team members in the crowd, their own hidden cameras capturing the scene from different angles, ensuring that no detail would be missed. When this footage was reviewed, she knew that upstairs her technical team was already archiving every second of film, creating backups that would make denial impossible. Officer Rodriguez had finally stopped laughing, his expression shifting to uncertainty as the confrontation dragged on longer than usual. Even Officer Chen had taken a step forward, perhaps sensing that something about this situation felt different from their usual displays of power. Sarah maintained her facade of confusion and distress by carefully monitoring the time. Judge Harrison would be arriving soon, and everything was falling perfectly into place. The officer's continued behavior, growing more outrageous with each passing moment, was better than anything she could have scripted. What happened next would be talked about in courthouse break rooms across the country for years to come. Officer Miller, still clutching Sarah's phone like a trophy, suddenly noticed something odd about the device. The cracked screen seemed to be displaying a live feed interface with the White House seal watermarked in the corner. His grip loosened slightly as confusion crossed his face. But before he could process what he was seeing, Sarah had already set the next phase of her plan in motion. The supposedly meek and confused young woman straightened her posture ever so slightly as she reached into her worn messenger bag, pulling out a small leather wallet that had been carefully hidden beneath a stack of deliberately messy papers. Officer Rogers, who had been enjoying his partner's display of authority, felt the first stirring of unease as he caught a glimpse of gold embossing on the wallet, his years of experience suddenly screaming at him that something was very wrong with this situation. Sarah maintained her character for a few moments longer, watching as Miller finally looked more closely at the phone in his hand, his face draining of. The situation escalated into something truly extraordinary as Sarah decided to demonstrate exactly why she had been chosen for this nationwide courthouse reform initiative. Standing in the center of the now silent lobby, she began addressing the gathered crowd, first in perfect Mandarin, explaining to several elderly observers exactly what rights they had been denied, That morning, her accent so flawless that several native speakers unconsciously stepped forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to barely concealed triumph. Officer Miller, who had prided himself on his authority, just moments ago stood rooted to the spot as Sarah smoothly transitioned into formal Japanese, bowing slightly to an elderly gentleman who had been dismissed earlier that morning, then flowing into rapid-fire Korean that had several young law students furiously taking notes, her words in each language carrying the weight of federal authority as she outlined the specific regulations and rights that had been violated in just the past hour alone. Without missing a beat, Sarah shifted into fluent Spanish, her words clearly intended for Officer Rodriguez, who had stopped leaning against his pillar and now stood ramrod straight as she detailed his complicity through inaction, her tone professional, but her meaning crystal clear. Several Spanish-speaking citizens in the crowd nodded vigorously as she explained their rights regarding language access and proper treatment by courthouse personnel. Officer Rogers looked like he might actually pass out as he realized the magnitude of the situation unfolding before him. The linguistic display continued as Sarah moved effortlessly into French, explaining to a visiting Canadian legal team exactly what they were witnessing, her precise legal terminology in each language, demonstrating a mastery that went far beyond simple translation. She was now commanding the space that the officers had so recently dominated, her previously hunched shoulders thrown back as she stood to her full height, the oversized Yale sweater somehow looking more like a chosen disguise than a sign of casual dress. What made the situation even more powerful was how Sarah wove contemporary street slang into her multiple language presentations, switching between formal legal terminology and casual expression with practiced ease. This particular skill she knew would appear in the training videos she was creating, showing how true professionalism meant being able to communicate effectively at all levels. She could see several of her team members hiding smiles as the officers grew increasingly uncomfortable with each demonstration of her capabilities. Officer Chen, who had previously kept his distance, now found himself the focus of Sarah's attention as she switched back to Mandarin, this time using a specific dialect from his family's home region. His face reddened as she addressed his earlier behavior, mixing in references to cultural respect and professional duty that hit particularly close to home. The other officers watched their colleagues squirm, understanding enough from his reaction to know that Sarah was dismantling their entire power structure one language at a time. The young mother with the baby had pulled out her phone, recording everything by bouncing her child, who had finally quieted, seemingly captivated by Sarah's linguistic performance. Nearby, the elderly man who had struggled with the form requirements earlier was nodding vigorously as Sarah outlined in perfect Vietnamese exactly how the proper procedure should have been handled. His previous embarrassment transformed into righteous understanding. Sarah maintained perfect composure as she demonstrated command, not just of languages but of courthouse regulations, citizen rights, and proper procedural conduct in each language she spoke. She referenced specific cases, relevant cultural considerations, and legal precedents that showcased just how thoroughly she had prepared for this operation. Officer Miller had long since given up any pretense of authority, now staring at his shoes, but Officer Rogers seemed to be having trouble remembering how to form words in any language. The crowd had grown larger as courthouse employees from other floors found excuses to witness what had become an unprecedented display of authority meeting accountability. Sarah could see her team strategically positioned throughout the space, their cameras capturing every angle of what would soon become mandatory viewing in courthouse training programs across the country. As she finally returned to English, her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made everyone lean in slightly to listen. She was about to deliver her final point when the perfect moment presented itself. Judge Harrison entered the scene like an actor arriving perfectly on cue, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the marble floor as he descended the main staircase, his black robes billowing slightly with each step. The theatrical timing of his appearance could not have been better if Sarah had orchestrated it herself, which of course she had down to the precise minute. His expression shifted from judicial sternness to carefully concealed amusement as he absorbed the unprecedented scene before him. The judge had known Sarah Chen for years, having worked with her on multiple federal reform initiatives, but watching her systematic dismantling of courthouse prejudice in person was something entirely different. He paused at the foot of the stairs, one hand resting on the polished banister, as he observed Officer Rogers, whose face had achieved a shade of red previously unknown to medical science, while Officer Miller seemed to be attempting to physically shrink into his own uniform. Their earlier arrogance completely evaporated in the face of mounting revelations. Sarah acknowledged the judge's presence with a slight nod, but continued her masterful performance, now addressing the crowd in Arabic. Her words causing several Middle Eastern visitors to break into broad smiles as they finally understood the full scope of what they were witnessing. Judge Harrison watched as his courthouse officers, previously so proud of their authority, struggled to maintain their composure as they realized that every moment of their behavior had been documented from multiple angles. The other courthouse employees, who had gathered to watch what they thought would be routine harassment of a confused immigrant, now stood in uncomfortable silence, many of them no doubt remembering similar incidents they had witnessed or participated in over the years. Judge Harrison could see his court reporter Miranda furiously taking notes, probably already imagining the memo that would circulate through the judicial system by days, and the story of how the White House counsel had exposed systemic discrimination through brilliant undercover work. Officer Chen had backed himself against a wall, looking like he might actually attempt to merge with it, as Sarah smoothly transitioned into Cantonese, specifically using phrases that referenced respect, authority, and shame in ways that made several elderly observers nod in solemn agreement. Judge Harrison noticed how his most veteran bailiff, Officer Thompson, had quietly begun edging toward the exit, probably remembering his own less than professional behavior from earlier that morning. The young mother, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, was now standing proudly, her baby quiet in her arms, as she watched justice unfold in real time around her. The elderly man with the rejected paperwork had found his way to one of Sarah's team members, who was quietly helping him fill out the proper forms. The entire lobby had transformed from a place of intimidation to one of emerging accountability. Judge Harrison finally cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the marble walls like a thunderclap, causing every head to turn in his direction, except for Sarah, who continued her precise dismantling of systemic prejudice without missing a beat. She had timed this moment, knowing that the judge's presence would add another layer of authority to the proceedings. The security cameras whirred quietly above, capturing every moment of what would soon become a landmark case in courthouse reform. Officer Rogers finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak, as he attempted to explain himself to the judge. But Harrison held up one hand, the gesture carrying the weight of decades on the bench, silencing the officer mid-syllable. The judge stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the hushed lobby. As he positioned himself precisely where Sarah had calculated he would, creating a perfect frame for the cameras that would capture this moment for training programs across the nation. The atmosphere in the courthouse had transformed completely from the tense, hostile environment of the morning into something entirely different. There was a sense of witnessing history in the making as Sarah finally turned to acknowledge Judge Harrison directly, her casual disguise now seeming more like a costume in a brilliantly executed play. Several of her team members had moved to block the exits, ensuring that everyone involved would remain present for what was about to happen next. The recognition that rippled through the courthouse lobby hit like a wave, first touching Officer Rogers, then spreading outward as Judge Harrison addressed Sarah, not as a confused citizen, but as Madam Counsel, his deep voice carrying the formal title to every corner of the suddenly silent space. The judge took deliberate steps forward, his black robes adding gravity to each movement, as he asked Sarah about their scheduled meeting regarding the new federal courthouse conduct guidelines that would be implemented nationwide. Officer Miller, who still hadn't fully recovered from the language display, now looked like he might actually be sick, as he watched Judge Harrison bow slightly to Sarah, a gesture of respect he had never shown to any courthouse employee in his 15 years on the bench. The other officers scattered throughout the lobby began exchanging panicked glances as they realized that every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every act of discrimination they had displayed that morning was now documented evidence in what was clearly a federal investigation. Sarah maintained her professional composure as she slowly removed her Yale sweater, revealing an impeccably tailored Armani suit underneath. The transformation was stunning as she shifted from appealing as a confused immigrant to embodying her role as one of the most powerful legal authorities in the country. Officer Rogers, who had been so quick to dismiss her earlier, now seemed to be having trouble breathing as he recognized her from last month's Justice Department press conference, where she had announced a zero-tolerance policy for courthouse discrimination. The young mother in the crowd gasped as she suddenly recognized Sarah from a viral video where she had challenged a Supreme Court justice on immigration reform. The elderly man with his paperwork problems was beaming as he realized he had witnessed something extraordinary. Several law students in the crowd had begun furiously typing on their phones, no doubt sharing on social media how they had just watched the legendary Sarah Chen in action. Her reputation for exposing systemic discrimination through undercover operations preceding her. Judge Harrison, who had been briefed on the operation weeks ago, played his part, perfectly expressing careful concern as Sarah began outlining her preliminary findings, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position. She referenced specific incidents from that morning, calling out times and violations with devastating precision. Officer Chen looked ready to retire on the spot as she replayed his earlier comments about immigrants not understanding simple English, her perfect recall making it clear that every moment had been carefully documented. The courthouse employees, who had gathered to watch what they thought would be routine entertainment, now stood frozen as Sarah methodically listed every violation of federal guidelines she had witnessed that morning. Officer Rodriguez had stopped trying to maintain his casual stance, now standing at attention as she referenced his failure to intervene when witnessing clear discrimination, his law enforcement training finally kicking in as he realized the serious nature of the situation. Sarah pulled out her phone, now holding it confidently, as she showed Judge Harrison the live stream feed her hidden camera had been broadcasting directly to the White House Ethics Committee. Officer Miller caught a glimpse of the viewer list and visibly swayed on his feet as he recognized names of federal judges, Supreme Court clerks, and Congressional Oversight Committee members who had witnessed his behavior in real time. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and absolutely irrefutable. The transformation in the lobby was complete as Sarah stood at its center, now every inch the federal authority she had always been. Her earlier performance as a confused citizen now serving as a masterclass in how prejudice and discrimination would be documented and exposed. Officer Rogers, who had been so quick to abuse his power earlier, now stood with his shoulders slumped, his badge seeming to weigh heavily on his chest as he realized his career might end over a morning of casual cruelty that he had never expected to be accountable for. Judge Harrison cleared his throat again, this time to announce that his chambers would be conducting emergency meetings with all courthouse staff regarding proper conduct and federal guidelines. Sarah nodded her approval as she pulled out her official White House credentials, letting them catch the light as she prepared to reveal exactly how this morning's documentation would reshape courthouse conduct policies across the entire nation. In the deafening silence that followed, Sarah finally revealed the full scope of her operation, pulling up a holographic display from her phone that projected into the lobby, showing a comprehensive breakdown of every discrimination incident recorded that morning, the data floating in the air like silent accusations, each point highlighted with timestamps, video clips, and detailed annotations. Officer Rogers stared at his own face, captured in high definition, as he berated the elderly man over paperwork, while Officer Miller watched himself scrolling on his phone. While citizens waited for help, the evidence was irrefutable and displayed with devastating precision. The courthouse had become a stage for accountability as Sarah walked through the holographic display, pointing out specific incidents that violated not just federal guidelines but basic human dignity, her designer suit catching the light as she moved through the data with practiced ease behind her. Judge Harrison nodded at each point, his presence adding judicial weight to every observation. Several of Sarah's team members had positioned themselves near the exits, still recording as some courthouse employees tried to discreetly distance themselves from the unfolding situation. Officer Chen had given up all pretense of authority, now sitting heavily on a nearby bench as Sarah played back his dismissive comments about non-English speakers, complete with subtitles in multiple languages. The young mother who had witnessed everything clutched her baby closer as she watched the morning replay, seeing herself in the footage and realizing she had been part of a historic moment in judicial reform. Officer Rodriguez had assumed a parade rest stance, his law enforcement training finally kicking in as he realized the serious nature of his passive participation. Sarah moved through the crowd with measured steps, her earlier submissive posture completely transformed into one of absolute authority. She approached Officer Miller, who had finally stopped attempting to explain himself, his mouth opening and closing without sound as she replayed his worst moments from multiple angles. The security cameras above had captured everything, creating a comprehensive view of the systematic discrimination that had become routine in the courthouse. Officer Rogers seemed to age years as he watched his casual cruelty displayed in high definition, his face growing paler with each new piece of evidence. The most powerful moment came when Sarah pulled up a split screen showing similar incidents from other courthouses across the country, revealing that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a nationwide pattern that she had been systematically documenting and exposing. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the evidence mounted, showing how casual discrimination had become institutionalized in the very places meant to dispense justice. Several law students had tears in their eyes as they witnessed the intersection of law ethics and accountability playing out before them. Judge Harrison stepped forward, then his judicial robes sweeping the marble floor as he officially requested copies of all documentation for immediate review. Sarah nodded to one of her team members, who began transferring files, their tablets lighting up with damning evidence that would soon become part of mandatory training programs nationwide. Officer Miller finally found his voice, stammering out apologies that seemed hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence, while Officer Rogers appeared to have lost the ability to speak altogether. The transformation in the lobby was complete as Sarah stood at its center, now every inch the federal authority she had always been. Her earlier performance as a confused citizen serving as a masterclass in how prejudice and discrimination could be documented and exposed. The young mother had begun recording everything on her phone, understanding that she was witnessing something that would be talked about in law schools for years to come. Several elderly visitors who had faced similar discrimination stood straighter now as they watched justice unfold in real time. Sarah raised her hand for silence, though it was hardly necessary as the entire courthouse seemed to be holding its breath. She began outlining the immediate changes that would be implemented, her voice carrying the full weight of federal authority, as she announced that this courthouse would become a pilot program for new anti-discrimination measures. Officer Rogers finally managed to step forward, perhaps to defend himself, but Sarah silenced him with a single look that carried the force of the entire Justice Department behind it. The story of the undercover White House counsel exploded across social media platforms within hours, shocking waves rippling through the justice system as Sarah Chen's masterfully executed operation became the catalyst for unprecedented reform. Clips of Officer Rogers and Officer Miller's behavior played on national news networks, while legal experts analyzed every moment of the confrontation. Courthouse employees across the country watched in stunned silence as they recognized their own casual discriminations reflected in the footage. Within days, Sarah had established a comprehensive training program using the footage from that morning as its cornerstone. Officer Rogers and Miller unexpectedly became its strongest advocates, their very public transformation from antagonists to champions of reform, carrying a powerful message about accountability and change. The young mother from the lobby had been invited to speak at congressional hearings, Her testimony about witnessing the operation firsthand bringing several senators to tears as she described how Sarah had exposed the subtle ways discrimination had become normalized in the justice system. Officer Chen found himself in an unusual position as he began conducting sensitivity training sessions in Mandarin, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and immigrant communities. His own experience of being caught in Sarah's operation gave him unique insight into how casual prejudice could infect even those who should know better. Officer Rodriguez took charge of implementing new language access protocols, his previous inaction transformed into passionate advocacy as he worked to ensure no citizen would face the barriers he had once ignored. The elderly man whose paperwork troubles had sparked the confrontation became something of a celebrity in legal reform circles, his story appearing in law school textbooks as an example of how systematic change could begin with a single incident. Sarah had personally helped him complete his documents that day, the photograph of them together becoming a symbol of the new era in courthouse conduct. His granddaughter, a law student herself, now conducted workshops on citizen rights using his experience as a teaching tool. Judge Harrison took the lead in implementing Sarah's reforms, his courthouse becoming a model for others across the nation. Security cameras that had once simply observed now became tools for accountability. The footage regularly reviewed to ensure the new standards were being maintained. The lobby, where everything had unfolded, was transformed into a welcome center with multilingual staff and clear instructions posted in dozens of languages. The marble floors that had once echoed with discrimination now rang with voices speaking in many tongues, all treated with equal respect. Sarah Chen became known as the architect of justice. Reform, her methods controversial, but her results undeniable. She continued her undercover operations across the country, each new revelation leading to better training, more accountability, and deeper understanding. Law enforcement agencies, initially resistant to her approach, began requesting her presence, hoping to proactively address discrimination before being exposed themselves. Her yam sweater and ripped jeans became famous in their own right, displayed in the National Civil Rights Museum as symbols of how change could wear many disguises. Officer Rogers and Miller found unexpected purpose in their new roles, traveling to police academies and courthouses, sharing their story with unflinching honesty. Their testimony about how easily authority could corrupt and how necessary accountability had become formed the backbone of new training protocols. Their personal journey from discrimination to awareness resonating deeply with other law enforcement officers facing similar challenges in their own jurisdictions. The young law students who had witnessed everything that day carried the lesson forward into their careers, many becoming advocates for reform themselves. Their presence in courthouses marked by a dedication to ensuring equal treatment for all citizens. The video footage from that morning became required viewing in law schools nationwide, sparking passionate discussions about the role of authority, accountability, and justice in modern society. 1 year after the incidents, Sarah returned to the courthouse, this time wearing her usual power suit. She found a transformed institution where citizens of all backgrounds received equal treatment, where multiple languages filled the air without prejudice, where Officer Rogers and Miller greeted everyone with genuine respect. Their own transformation having inspired similar changes across the nation. As she stood in the lobby where everything had begun, Sarah smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest changes in justice began with a single person willing to appear powerless in order to expose the true nature of power.